I think governance actually plays a big part in this because understanding how the decisions are made and who's making the decisions in the project, I think can have a big influence on how healthy the project is and how sustainable it is and how new contributors and existing contributors feel about the way the project is run, because projects that don't have really any.
Hi, welcome to the G-Research Open Source Software Outreach Podcast, the GR-OSS OUT Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Faulkner, and we're here as always to try to do a real world of working on open source, contributing to it, and sort of going through that journey. And today I've got with us a guest who's done quite a bit of open source consulting. I'm totally interested in hearing her perspective on how open source works. Dawn Foster. So Dawn, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and, like where we might have known you from in the open source world?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Jay, so much for having me on the podcast. I've been in the tech industry for well over 30 years at this point, and I've spent quite a bit of that work working in open source. And I ended up working in open source sort of accidentally, I guess. I was a sysadmin back in the mid 90s for a manufacturing company, and it turns out manufacturing companies do not want to spend money on IT. So I found, I found all this open source software, and it was pretty cool. And at the time, we didn't have these nice package managers, right? You downloaded tarballs and compiled them, and then compiled the dependencies, and then and then a week later, you would have the thing that you actually wanted to install in the first place. And so that was my introduction into, I would say, using open source software. And then fast forward 5 years to when I worked at Intel. So I was at Intel, and I started there in around 2000. And they needed someone to look strategically at third-party open source software developer tools and developer tools that ran on Linux for a big enabling project for a processor that never actually got any market traction. So we'll leave it at that. But what I was responsible for was looking strategically at these open source projects and figuring out which ones we wanted to enable on our new technologies. And so this involved a lot of looking at these open source communities. And I got really fascinated by how these open source communities function, right? From the outside, it looks like this random group of people throwing some software together. And then you end up with something that not only works, but works really, really well. And I took that and I pivoted into doing open source pretty much full time for most of the rest of my career. I spent a few years doing open source community work at startups that again no longer exist. This was a long time ago. And then I ended up back at Intel managing a community for some mobile open source operating systems, Migo and then Kaizen. And after that, I ended up at Puppet. So I was responsible for the Puppet open source community and a few other related functions at Puppet. So that was kind of getting back to my roots, right? So as a sysadmin, I got to work on config management tools, which was really, really a lot of fun. And I did that for a few years. And then for my midlife crisis, I decided that I was going to quit my job at Puppet, sell my house and my car in Portland, and pack a few suitcases and move to London to get a PhD, which I did. So I studied the Linux kernel. I looked at how people collaborate in the Linux kernel, turned that into a PhD so that people could now call me Dr. Foster. And after that, I ended up back in the corporate world again. So I worked at Pivotal on some Kubernetes projects and some open source strategy there. Then we got acquired by VMware, where I was the director of open source community strategy for a few years. And after I did that, I decided to really kind of go into business for myself. So I do some consulting, but most of the work that I do right now is actually on the Chaos project. So we got some funding from the Sloan Foundation to fund some data science work. So I'm currently the director of data science at the Chaos project, and spending a lot of time thinking about open source software sustainability and how projects can become more sustainable.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's I don't think that people understand unless they've been in it how much with like, especially an older open source project, you have to focus on those sort of things to keep it going. Like OpenStack's been in existence. We were just celebrating our 15-year anniversary of a project. And one of the topics that constantly comes up is about making sure the door stays open to new contributors, making sure we keep new blood in there, because when you reach that age of a project, you start getting to the point where the expert in projects don't go on to a new job. They go on to retirement or to something else entirely. So, but I'm going to rewind first because a little bit behind the scenes, there's not a lot of coordination that happens before this. We just are having a conversation, sometimes with people I know, sometimes I don't. So I came into this not knowing at all that our paths into open source are mirrored very much. I was a sysadmin back in the early 2000s, sort of used that as my introduction to open source. I've often said that in terms of my story, I ran a website, oldOS.org, for a really long time. Someone donated a 32 megabyte VPS to that, and I learned how to site in the 32 megs of RAM. And so like those DevOps tools, the sysadmin foundation of like Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, that LAMP stack, that was the hot thing then, in the same way that like people like talking about Loki or Kubernetes or whatever now, hey, PHP and MySQL, that was the bee's knees in 2002, right? So that's kind of interesting. And I think it maybe gives us a different perspective. Do you think that like your history in operations and system administration maybe has changed the approach you would have to open source versus someone who might have started from a pure software background?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I do spend a lot of time thinking about really, really like the infrastructure behind a lot of the software that we have. And the fact that these open source projects, they need places to host things. We need to be able to, recover from something happening to a single person, so that, it's not one person who owns the DNS records, for example, or the domain names. And so I do think that I spend a lot of time thinking about open source sustainability, also from kind of an infrastructure perspective, and not just how are we developing the software and on GitHub and all of the things that I think maybe software developers tend to focus on.
Well, and it's almost like, in a way, I sort of view community as infrastructure, right? Like I'll often use some of the same approaches I would use to developing an infrastructure to looking at a community, like things like single points of failure. Like you learn the importance of not having a single point of failure in an organization. There's a value in not having that single point of failure. And you identified really, I think, something that caught a lot of older school open source projects or open communities by, it's like, who holds the keys to the domain name and the DNS? Like we've seen in modern news, the deal with WordPress and WP Engine, really what happened with Freenode turning into libera.chat, that there is a certain amount of community and goodwill, but then on the other side, they're like, you have to have systematic operational protections to make sure that doesn't get hijacked. I've often talked with Tabitha and other folks on Chaos as like trying to put metrics on open source, almost in a who can make the graph go up and to the right more. But is there any sort of approach or perspective that y'all have with that Chaos hat on of ensuring like redundancy and high availability in that community infrastructure that open source is built with?
That's a good question. I don't know that we specifically think of that from a chaos metrics perspective. We certainly have metrics defined that help people think about some of these things. So we have some metrics models, for example, that look at viability. And we have a guide that's all around assessing the viability of open source projects. And some of that it's things like governance, for example, and community. And looking at how resilient some of these projects are when, especially if you're a business or a company and you're deciding, do I incorporate this piece of technology in my product that I sell to make money to my customers, or do I incorporate this other project, and which one is likely to be better for me long term? And so, thinking about how critical some of these projects are to you and mirroring that with how healthy are those projects? And if they're not as healthy, how can you get involved and help mitigate any risks you might have by contributing to the project and making it better, making it more healthy, more sustainable?
I'm curious if there's been a case where maybe y'all or the metrics you represent, because I know you may not necessarily be working with the individual projects using all the metrics, but is there really a case where maybe that objective look, the metrics-based viewpoint on a project maybe exposed a gap in their viability or a gap in their governance that maybe they were blind to before the numbers came around, or at least like a couple of your favorite metrics for like highlighting things that maybe would stay hidden beneath the surface?
Yeah, I can't think of any specific examples off the top of my head, but I do have some favorite metrics that I like for projects to start with. One of them is it's what we call the contributor absence factor. So this is also sometimes called the bus factor. Apache calls it the pony factor. I've also heard it called the lottery factor. So this is, how many people need to disappear from your community before you'd be in real trouble. And in some cases, this is one person, right? What happens if the one person who is the sole maintainer, if something happens to that person or they, disappear and stop working on this tomorrow, what happens to that project? And so looking at this contributor sustainability and looking at projects that have, maybe a wide range of people who are maintaining the project, so that if one or two of them decided not to do this anymore, then the project could still succeed after that. So that's one of the key metrics that I like to look at. I also really like to look at responsiveness metrics. So things like time to first response and time to close, because there are a lot of different ways you can look at that from a community perspective. From a new user perspective, if I'm a new contributor, I put my heart and soul into this pull request that fixes this bug that I think is really important, and nobody responds to it, then I'm going to feel bad and I'm not going to contribute anymore, right? Whereas if one of the maintainers responds to me in a few hours and it's like, hey, thanks, I'm going to take a look at this, we'll review it, and it gets, merged in, a week or two, depending on the complexity of the PR, then I'm going to feel, as a new contributor, I'm going to feel pretty good. And then, but it also impacts, long-term contributors and people who are working in the project on a regular basis, because, if their contributions are taking forever to get closed, people tend to get frustrated and they're concerned that their contributions maybe aren't as, that people don't like their contributions as much. And so they're going to get a little bit sad about their contributions.
It's interesting how often there's like a force multiplier effect that can happen with some of these. Like you talked about responsiveness. Like I've worked on open source projects that aren't super responsive, but sometimes that's okay. Sometimes you post it a couple of weeks later, maybe your patch gets merged. Maybe the maintainer makes a couple of changes to it themselves and merge it. But what we've seen, and we've actually had to push an OpenStack, OpenStack's where I work at all the time. So I've got all the references there, but with OpenStack, we've been looking a lot at this, and the other piece that we've seen, and I feel like this combined with responsiveness leads to just like an exponential increase in frustration, is what I'm going to call a trickle reviewing, where someone will review and maybe identify one or two major issues with the change, but not give it a full end-to-end review, not give a full perspective of it. And that's really where it can get super frustrating, because you can go in there, I did everything you asked, even though you asked it 2 weeks later, and then they come back in another 2 weeks and say, oh, well, actually, you're not accounting for this other case. And you might have a patch that, even with a community that's not the most responsive, might have had 1 or 2 round trips of a week or two, instead now has 6 round trips of a couple weeks. And in reality, by the time it gets to that point, that patch is going to be sitting in the code review until someone who's a maintainer picks it up and carries it over the fence. So like, are there any other interesting like nexuses of where, like, if you combine like minor negative thing and minor negative thing, it can just kind of blow up a project a little bit?
Yeah, I think there are a few things that impact that. I think governance actually plays a big part in this, because understanding how the decisions are made and who's making the decisions in the project, I think can have a big influence on how healthy the project is and how sustainable it is, and how new contributors and existing contributors feel about the way the project is run. Because projects that don't have really any documented governance, nobody really knows what's going on, there's all this uncertainty, and that can have a big impact on lots of other areas within the project. And it can also, it can also have an impact on things like, just not knowing who owns what and who's responsible for what. And that can have a big impact if somebody leaves, or if there are, maybe there's some disruptive influence within the community, and there's some issue with a individual person. How do those things get resolved?
Yeah, and I think I mean, I'm not even going to pull one, because the open source landscape is littered with examples of communities that were built on almost, like, I'm going to say, goodwill and vibes and friendship and not a lot of governance. And then you get maybe one person in who has a toxic idea, or maybe has a different idea about the way they should treat other people or things like that. And it's almost like at that point, if you've gotten that far on trust and love and good feelings, you're almost too late to build in the structural control to prevent that one toxic influence from cratering the whole project. And I think we've seen that over and over again in some open source communities, where it really only takes just a little bit of someone being even an unintentional bad actor if you don't have those guardrails up. So if you were looking at one of these communities today, you see this community, it's got 3-4 people, they've been working on this, they're all good vibes and feels there's no need for governance here, and you're trying to give them advice to build up those walls so that they can maybe protect themselves from that influence. What would you do? What would you do to help them take that friendship and codify it, so to speak?
Yeah, that is my biggest piece of governance advice to people, is to build out the governance before you need it, and hope that the things that you're building in, you hope that you're never going to need them. But you should have, at a minimum, some kind of description about who makes decisions. And for most open source projects, especially the small ones, and like the ones you described, where it's, a group of friends working on vibes and good feels, it can be, the maintainers make the decisions. They, by consensus if possible, sometimes a vote if needed, but having that documented somewhere. And then the other piece that I always recommend that people have, and then this is the one that you really hope you never ever need, but have a way to remove people from the project all the way up to the top level. Have a process in place for how to remove key maintainers, how to remove founders, how to remove steering committee members. Have some process in place to be able to remove that toxic person. And then you hope you never need it. But the problem is, once you get into this environment where you have an issue and your governance processes don't address that issue, it's going to be really hard to fix it, because your project's already in crisis. You don't have the governance you need. And at that point, it's kind of too late.
Well, and there's really interesting, again, like, I kind of think the intersections of these things are super interesting, right? Because you were talking earlier about, I'm a lottery guy. I picked the lottery factor as my preferred name. One day the Mega Millions is going to hit, and then you're never going to see my face on this podcast again. But until then, get to hang out. The question I would always ask about that and governance is that there's almost a technical aspect of it in here, of that if you've got someone who is so powerful or invaluable to the project that their removal would tear down the project, then what governance do you really have? It's almost like a BDFL, or for those who might know, benevolent dictator for life, which is sort of the pleasant term put to situations like the Linux kernel, where maybe there's just like a person at the top who's there because of goodwill and positioning and historical reasons, who is trusted to be benevolent. Like, if you've got a technical pillar in your community that's that strong, regardless of what your government might say, that person holds an immense amount of power. So you almost have to take a community governance approach and also a technical approach of, if this is an error case, if this is a threat model that we're worried about, then we also have to make sure that everyone's got an understudy, that everyone has a backup, that folks are working together. And I would hope that there's almost a preventative aspect that has in itself. If you've got mentorship, mentor-mentee relationships throughout your project and understudies people, you're rarely going to get that situation where someone's allowed to be an outsized amount of toxic.
A piece of what you just said, I think, succession planning, I think is really important. So knowing who would take over if something happened to someone who is in a top leadership position. But I think too, these conversations are hard, right? How do you remove someone who would be so incredibly important to the project? How would that even work? But I also think that on the flip side, if that person who's in that, let's just say it's the benevolent dictator for life, the BDFL, if that person is so incredibly toxic, the project is probably going to implode anyways. So you've got a choice. Like, do you let the project implode naturally because of this toxic individual, or do you remove that toxic individual and hope for the best? And and it depends. Like in some cases, you can't. Like there are, you know, and especially in the case of a BDFL, they probably own all of the assets personally, and so yeah, and these are cases where you end up with with forks, for example.
Yeah, and I don't think that it's always a negative thing, right? Like a lot of folks will think that an open source a fork is almost hostile, but sometimes that can be a positive thing in and around that. So circling, I feel like we've sort of gone down the dark path. Is there like a happy path here? Is there a thing that you find that when you metric a project that maybe the metrics can shine a happy light, that a contributor could go and look and maybe see that something is outsized, the flip side of that coin, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things that's most important when you're thinking about metrics, I think there are two things that are really important. One is looking at the metrics that matter for your project. So what are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to do? Are you, because the hockey stick up and to the right is great if you've got loads of maintainers and you're getting loads of new contributors. But if you have one single maintainer and you're getting, a whole bunch of new contributors, maybe that's not so great. So I think it goes beyond just looking at the metrics and looking at interpretation. So what are you trying to achieve, which drives which metrics you decide you want to focus on? But also, how do you interpret it? So I think this is one thing that I think is really important, because I think a lot of people, you look at the metrics, let's say we're looking at responsiveness, and there's this huge dip in the responsiveness for 2 months. So if that dip, let's say it's a project with loads of European contributors, if that dip is around July, August, September, that's probably a good thing, because your maintainers are on holiday and they're enjoying their time off and they're resting and recharging. And that's probably a good thing for your project to have that dip. Also, again, sort of between US Thanksgiving and New Year's, there's usually a bit of a lull in most projects. And I see that as a healthy thing, because people are taking time off, they're spending time with their families, they're taking some time for themselves. And so I think that's really good. And looking at the spikes too and interpreting those, and looking at, oh, we had this huge, maybe spike in contributions. Oh, well, that's when we were focused on Hacktoberfest, or that's when we had some new Google Summer of Code students, or that's when the big conference was, and we had this big hackathon, and we encouraged a bunch of people to contribute. So looking at the dips and the peaks in your community and interpreting those and looking at what they mean for your community, I think is really important.
It's like you're humanizing the metric, right? Like you're using the metric and you're asking it, like, what human situation happened to cause this metric to change? And often that can tell a happy story or a sad story. You pointed out lots of happy cases. We went down a lot of the sad cases before. These metrics, I was not always a person who was kind of sold on metrics. I've been, I would say, maybe damaged by some corporate environments that were overly metrics focused. So you end up with a situation where people are maybe trying to game metrics a little bit. So I would be kind of curious and interested if you see that happening at all, if y'all have reached that second stage with chaos metric projects, of where maybe you might have projects that are trying to get a high score rather than improve the community.
Yes, I've seen that way too often. I had some friends who worked at a very large tech company that will go unnamed, and they were being measured on number of commits to open source projects. And so this guy that I was talking to was like, yeah, so everything's a commit. It doesn't make sense, but every change I make is a commit, so that my commit numbers are high, so that management is happy with me. And so he was totally gaming how he was being measured. There was another example when I worked at VMware. I had metrics for basically all of our open source projects that hit a certain threshold of activity. And I had a certain set of metrics, and there were just like 4 of them. There was time to close, time to first response, uh, release cadence, and contributor sustainability. So it was basically the bus factor, lottery factor metrics. And one of the business unit managers basically said that he was going to include an OKR, so like the thing that people are measured on, that they had to meet a certain threshold, period, for their projects. And I was like, no, please don't do that, because those thresholds are arbitrary. And it was a threshold that I had set, which worked for most projects of the certain type that we had, but didn't work for a lot of the projects. And I was like, these thresholds are arbitrary. You can't hold these poor engineers to these thresholds. I was like, how about if instead of that, what you say is that they have to make one tangible improvement to something in the project every quarter or whatever. So they ended up taking that as their measurement, which I was happy with, because you're going to improve something and isn't necessarily tied to some arbitrary metric. So that was like the sad thing of what they were going to do before, and then the happy flip side of what we ended up with.
Yeah, we actually we had a similar, very historical issue in OpenStack where we would in OpenStack we basically have most projects are a 2-layer kind of system. We have just a normal contributor, normal reviewers, they contribute code, whatever. And then we have what we call core reviewers, which are fancy word for just the maintainer group. 2 core reviewers vote, it can land, then it lands, right? So what we started seeing very early in the land of OpenStack, and I say this as if I was the guy watching it happen as the junior on the team, but you would often have people who would prioritize reviewing numbers. So we actually had a situation where it was very obvious someone was just downloading every patch and running a spell against it. And so we had, every patch in the project was reviewed with every spelling thing picked out. That's not necessarily not a good review, but it definitely is a trickle review, kind of going back to what we said before. And it sort of shows that you get what you metric. But on the flip side, and this is kind of where I want to go with it, is people think of contribution in terms of commits, in terms of codes. That's one thing I like about that, a tangible improvement, because tangible improvement doesn't have to be code necessarily. And in an OpenStack, we find that a lot of our projects are actually limited by review bandwidth, especially in those core teams. So, I always look at the how many commits have you made metric, and I put that alongside how many reviews have you made. And those are kind of 2 things that work together that you need to see it get up there. But it's interesting and it's a hard problem. But I can't let you go without talking a little bit about a PhD in Linux kernel community. So, do you want to, can you take 3 years of your life and, what's probably a 100-page thesis and summarize it in 3 minutes for me? Because that sounds super interesting. And I am sure that we're going to lose absolutely no detail whatsoever. Just cramming it into the last 5 minutes of a podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was loads of fun. So when I decided I wanted to go back to school and get a PhD, I knew that I wanted to do it on the Linux kernel. And the reason for that was, I'd spent loads of time at Intel, and we hired tons of kernel developers. And they spent all of their time working with our favorite competitors to do things like, improve the memory management of Linux, or to, so it's beyond, people think of Intel as just writing a bunch of drivers, but the Intel kernel engineers made loads of really significant improvements across the entire kernel. But when they were doing that, they were doing it, alongside all of our competitors. And I was really fascinated by how these, and backing up a little bit, almost everyone who works on the Linux kernel is paid to do so by some company. So that's something that we know, and that I knew going into it. So this is not necessarily like the altruistic volunteer community. So I was really interested in how these people worked together. And so I pitched this idea of doing a PhD on the kernel and looking at this collaboration and how people work together. And so it was interesting. In particular, I looked at how people collaborate on the mailing list, because what people listening may or may not know, but the way the Linux kernel is built is by patches sent to mailing lists. they don't do GitHub. It's not a GitHub pull request and then review kind of model. It's a review of a patch that's sent to a mailing list. So I sampled a couple of different mailing lists because the kernel has a whole bunch of them. I had 200 and some when I was doing my research. I focused on one of the PCI lists because it was really active, had lots of people, and seemed fairly representative of the rest of the community. And then I looked at a bunch of ways people collaborate. So I also interviewed, I think, 16 or 18 kernel developers and asked them a whole bunch of questions about how they worked together. And it's interesting, because I interviewed them and talked to them, and then I gathered a whole bunch of data and looked at how it really worked. And it was interesting for a couple of reasons. So a lot of these kernel developers consider themselves kernel developers first and employees of their company second. So that means that if I'm a kernel developer, I see myself as a kernel developer. And if I work at Intel today and Red Hat tomorrow, I'm probably going to be working on all of the same things for the most part. So that's how they kind of see themselves. And you see this in the job changes. So you see people, when you look at what company they work for, you see them change jobs. People also say that, it doesn't matter where in the world someone lives, we all collaborate kind of equally. And that's what kernel developers say. And I was pretty skeptical of that because of just the nature of how time zones work. If you and I are in the same time zone and we're collaborating on something, we might collaborate more with each other because more of our daytime overlaps than somebody else. What I found is that was not true at all. I was totally wrong. It really didn't matter where you were. People weren't more likely to collaborate with people in the same time zone. The other thing I found that I didn't think was going to be true, and I was wrong about and surprised by, is that there's also more people who work for the same company also collaborate with each other on the kernel mailing lists. And it's so easy when you work at a company to just, pop by someone's desk or pop into your private Slack channel or just there's all kinds of private ways that you could chat with someone who's also an employee at the same company. And that may or may not happen for sure. I'm sure it does. But they were actually more likely to work together on the kernel mailing list in the public than if they worked for two completely different companies. And some of that might just be influenced by the fact that you tend to work on similar things.
I've often thought that there was a lot in common between, a project like OpenStack in that it's large, it's enterprisey. Not a lot of college students just spending their Mondays, throwing code in OpenStack, right? We're a bunch of paid people, and there's a lot of that parallels. Like, sorry, boss Dave and Alex, if you're listening, but I'm an OpenStack developer before I'm a G-Research open source software engineer. I just am. I've been working in that community for 12 years. It's spanned multiple jobs, so it's not even a question of thinking that. And the other thing, and this is, if you're listening to this podcast, you don't know a lot about the inner workings of open source and corporate thing, leave with this. And that's that just because someone works at the same company doesn't mean that they agree. That there are oftentimes in the OpenStack community, we will see people working at the same company with diametrically opposed approaches, diametrically opposed ways of solving problems, or even things that they care about. Like sometimes those arguments on the mailing list are happening because I know that at least one prominent open source company has an explicit policy that you are allowed to do what's best for upstream, even if it's not what's best for the company. And I think that's important for people to know a little bit, that it can be easy to sort of try to blame a big corporate monster for some sort of technical decision that's been made. But the reality is that most of the time that's actually individuals taking those actions and guiding it, that the decisions that happen at the more corporate level are what gets focused on. So if you've got a project that you like that's maintained by that project and they're not doing a good job of security, maybe don't blame the individual then, maybe blame the priorities. But, there was no giant conspiracy to bring out System D. There was no, there's none of this stuff is ever happening. It's always individuals trying to win technical arguments. And even if they're at the same company, you got to do that in public on the mailing list. I actually love that. I expected that to be the PhD story about Linux kernel. I expected there to be all sorts of unearthed dirt there. But I think maybe people are very invested in unearthing the dirt from the mailing list. So you got to find a few of the gems. It sounds really nice.
I deliberately stayed away from that. So I did no sentiment analysis. I didn't actually look at the content of any of the messages. I looked at who replied to who and a whole bunch of characteristics about those people with really complicated statistical models behind all of it. And so looking at a whole bunch of different variables and looking at which people responded to which other people and looking at that as the influence. And it was interesting. I had an advantage because I had been in this industry for so long and I knew a lot of the kernel developers. I had access that a lot of people wouldn't be able to get interviews with kernel developers. I did because they knew who I was and they knew that I was, reasonably legitimate. But the other thing that I did throughout the whole PhD, I went to and gave a presentation in the Linux kernel track of all of the open source summits, the EU one and the North America one. And I presented where I was in my research, what I found. And it was a really good reality check. So if Greg KH is sitting there nodding, I'm like, oh, phew, that must be good. But I also got some really good suggestions from people. They were like, oh, well, did you think of this variable? It's like, oh, no. Oh, and that had a big impact when I added that variable. So actually doing the research was really cool, but spending time with these people and validating the fact that, the results and what I was finding was really valuable.
Yeah, again, that operational sort of influence of going and doing a little bit of an RCA on the community after the fact. And sometimes you unearth the heroes and stuff in those. That's nice. And but we've both been in the tech industry and open source for a long time. We've seen ups and downs. We've seen kind of the happy side. We've seen the sad side. And one of the things we always like to talk to everyone about who comes on the podcast is that, a little bit of a gross moment they might have had in open source, something where maybe you experienced some trouble or got knocked down a little bit and how you got through it and picked yourself back up. So do you have maybe a gross moment to share with our audience here today before we wrap up?
Yeah, I'm gonna share one about governance, and I'm not gonna talk about which project it was, but there was a particular project that had a technical steering committee or governing board or something along those lines. And one of the people on it was in other communities spouting just really awful derogatory things that weren't directed at an individual, but were directed at individuals of a certain type. And it was awful. It was just terrible. But because of the way the code of conduct was written and because of the way the governance documents were written, he wasn't violating the code of conduct because he was doing it elsewhere. And there was no way to remove someone who was on this board of, the steering committee. So the community actually had to wait it out until the next election. So they just had to wait until his term ended and wait for him he didn't run for re-election. I think you saw the writing on the wall. But then after that, they did put better governance in place and ways to remove people. And so now it's not gonna happen again in this particular community because they have ways to address it now. So that was my gross out moment.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to pull from that. And first of all is that if you're experiencing this, if you're seeing this, don't assume that person represents what the whole project is about. Go get help. Go talk to someone. I've been working on OpenStack for years and years. If there's some OpenStack senior leader who were to say something like that, I would want to know. I know that the other people in charge would want to know. We don't want to be represented that way. And the other thing here is kind of the flip side of if you're listening to this, these gross out moments, I'm really thinking about the junior engineer when I put it here. And that's that you can't build walls around your life. Like if you are going to be a part of a community, you're a whole person that's a part of that community. And part of being professional sometimes is not saying those things at all. I'm not the thought police. I can't say don't think them at all. You probably shouldn't, but that's, be aware that everything you say is going to reflect on your employer. It's going to reflect on your open source project. It's going to reflect on the friends who maybe you're vibing with in your small project that doesn't have governance yet, that it all reflects on everyone. And so, it's worth the time to go out of your way and try to be polite and kind. And even if you're having a hard conversation, to have some empathy, like just be a human. It's is pretty fun. So I appreciate that. I feel like we could have like 4 podcast episodes digging into the Dr. Foster of the Linux kernel, I'll say. Digging into that, but I think we're running out of time, and so I really do thank you, Dawn, for giving us this time. It's been a really fun talk. As always, I'd like to thank G Research for giving me the opportunity to do these podcasts on their platform. And if you're looking for a job, or really, G Research has a lot of stuff going on. If you're in the ML ecosystem at all, you're in the London area, go to gresearch.com. Look at it. There's some events going on. There are people hiring in vacancies. Just give it a look. Maybe you'll get an opportunity to go see a cool event at one of our nice offices up there. But for now, on behalf of me, I'm Jay Faulkner, Dawn Foster, our producer, Ben, and everyone here at G Research Open Source Software. That's the GR-OSS OUT Podcast. Thanks. Have a nice evening.